this is a spoiler,
You can't
you
listen to
know.
this and not have spoilers.
Ready to go.
There we go. It says live.
Okay, cool. All right, okie dokie. Well, who's
Mark.
so what's
It's
the
Mark.
so what's the origin here? And I saw Mark, I saw where you said that I think you guys are going to hate it. And maybe we can just like underscore that. But I wouldn't say I hated it. But
No
maybe we
way.
can, but I would start negative and then be able to work positively from it. I'm happy that they made The Thing after this, and that
There's
it's
a graphic
inspired
novel
aliens.
too.
Okay.
But Mark has to give us the, summary so we can, right? Since it's his choice.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Well, I'll give the rationale for the choice, and then I'll give the summary. So this is a meant to sync up more or less with the Partially Examined Life episode 203, where we in 202 talked about Julia Kristeva, and she's giving a psychoanalytic account of horror. Why are we horrified by things? Why are we disgusted by things? And I really wanted to apply that to something tangible, since it's instead of just talking about psychoanalytic jargon. So I suggested the Call of Cthulhu, and so that got me on a little Lovecraft kick. I read a bunch of more stories, and I returned to him time and again over the years, but it's been a long time. Certainly not with the idea in mind of thinking of him as philosophy, or how he would relate to philosophy, or how the general kind of thing that he's doing relates to philosophy, whether or not he is being philosophical or not. And so in particular, the connection with Kristeva was the idea that we're not necessarily afraid of something tangible, something in particular. That deep dread is kind of an existential thing. It's unfocused. It doesn't have a definite object. And that's what Lovecraft is known for, is having his boogeymen be something that is beyond human understanding, that is so out there that the mind cannot even comprehend it. So I wanted to go on and read this longer story because I'd never read this before. It had been talked up as I actually got into it, and I listened to your discussion that you folks had on the Call of Cthulhu from a little while back. I was not sure if this was going to kind of meet your literary standards. After listening through it, that was when I was listening through it as an audiobook, and it was kind of getting very long in some places, and very dry in some places. It in some ways eschews the flowery language that one associates with literature, though he has his own version of, maybe you could say purple prose if you don't think it's so mellifluous. But he definitely, when he's describing how horrible things are, can use a lot of adjectives. Let me put it that way. But there was, so this particular story, after I listened, got through the audiobook, and then I got turned on to the HP Lovecraft literary podcast, where they have like a 7-part introduction to this. And I was listening to that about Call of Cthulhu and other things. That really helped to sell, those guys are just really fans of this stuff.
Yeah, the major.
Yeah, and they read the quotes with creepy music going on, and it's a really good way of kind of pitching yourself. Even though I'd already heard the story, like that kind of convinced me that it was something to get excited about. And then I just got hold just a couple of days ago of this, the new annotated H.P. Lovecraft, this giant volume edited by Leslie Klinger and Alan Moore, or introduction by Alan Moore. And I might have to acquire this for myself. I really like this story now. Let me put it that way. So it was a long road, but I got there. The overall arc of the story, right? It's explorers going to the Antarctic. It's written by one of the scientists, this guy Dyer, and so it's a very dry scientific account, in some ways. One of the members of his party, a biologist, discovers a particular fossil, what looks like a 5-pointed a star-shaped footprint, that he gets very excited about because of the layer that it seems to be at, that it seems like at that they should be only looking at fossils that are very, very, very old, and yet this doesn't look like a trilobite. This looks like something more advanced. So he gets excited about that, wants to break off from the expedition, take a good portion of the people on the expedition. There's a couple dozen here, and go off a couple 100 miles to investigate further the direction that, for whatever reason, he thinks this thing came from. So the narrator does not go with them. So there's what we're hearing are radio dispatches and secondhand information from this other party. Lake is the guy's name, the biologist that's running this. They find buried in the ice some very well preserved specimens of a life form that nobody has ever seen before. So these are the main aliens of the story, and they are like giant barrels, and they have star-shaped heads, and they have very tendrils for their hands and their feet, and we can go into them. They're sort of part vegetable, part animal. They seem to just be these dead things buried in the ice. A big storm comes. The narrator loses contact with Lake and his crew. They don't hear back from them for days. They go to check it out. They find that entire crew is dead. Those fossils, those frozen alien things, seem to be gone. A couple of the bodies of their men, there's one man and one dog, have disappeared, and the rest are look like they've been dissected or ripped apart in strange ways. And they think maybe it's the one guy that disappeared, went mad and did this, but of course suspect that something much worse has happened. So the narrator Dyer and the rest of his team have gone to check out the remains here. He and this one guy Danforth decide they'll just take a quick trip up the mountain. They've this place where the Lake's party was decimated is right next to the famed Mountains of Madness that we can talk more about. It basically looks like an ancient city. So Dyer and Danforth go up into this ancient city. They see not only more of these tracks, but more so that they're pretty much the history of this whole civilization on the walls of this city, these frescoes. So he gives 2 straight chapters of how, yes, these were aliens and they came down and they lived here way before us, and they probably created us, and they created these beasts of burden, these giant shoggoth things, and at some point this city was abandoned. It seems like that the inhabitants went down into a place accessible from here under the sea, a giant abyss. The narrator and Danforth go to try to check that out as well. This is just a day trip. They're not doing very much. End up finding some of these. I'm supposed to give the whole spoilers, right? Give the whole.
Oh yeah, spoiler.
Okay.
This is what we're here for.
All right. So they find the decapitated bodies of the aliens that had apparently woken up in the ice, and are chased out of there by one of these shoggoths, these giant. They describe it as looking like a freight train. And, it's a massive 15-foot black thing with these eyes and appendages that are ever forming, and basically like a big piece of jello that can form limbs and things at will. So this thing has killed the aliens, that in turn, probably just because they woke up in the middle of a scary place and found these dogs attacking them, and these scientists, strange creatures, the humans trying to cut them open and things. And so it ends up that these, what were the aliens, what were so horrifying, ends up being something that the narrator wants us to sympathize with. That it's actually, we're getting a glimpse of a highly evolved, previously existent civilization, probably our parents in a certain way. But yet the thing that they created, these shoggoths, are the remaining monsters. And there's hints that there's even more horrible stuff, that there's next to the Mountains of Madness, which are forming the edge of this city, are even higher mountains, a couple that you can barely see, a few 100 miles off, that are in these frescoes. They're hesitant to even describe them. There's something unspeakably evil So it kind of puts in perspective that the horror that he stumbled upon ends up being more mundane, but points out a further horror, which as Dyer and Danforth are flying on their little plane away from their excursion back to the rest of the group, Danforth, the one who's not the narrator, sees something reflected in the mists behind them that looks like it might have been off of these further mountains of super madness, next to the mountains of madness that he can't even describe, but there's sort of some speculation about what sort of horrors they might involve. So, in some, unlike most of Lovecraft stories where there's just an unnameable horror that somebody sees and gets driven crazy by, this says a few different layers that it seems like there's an unnameable horror, but actually it's very much nameable, and they call them the elder things. So these mythical old ones that in many of his other stories are considered the gods end up just being advanced people, but yet they're still in the context of this wider, more horrific, still unknown universe.
That was really sharp. I'm afraid I like the story more now. That was cut through a lot of like the word, the purple words that we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to talk. I'd like to be able to get into this, and I feel like there's a couple of things that we need to cut through. What's going on? Laura, you said you think you know what's going on in the story. I'd like to hear what you think.
I think you're muted, Laura. Yes, you're definitely muted, Laura.
Here I am talking to myself.
And making all the great points.
I think I'm talking to the and I'm out. Okay. No, I think one of the first things, I know one of the first things that hits people when they read Lovecraft for the first time is his prose, which can be very off-putting. I think I read some, because I always check secondary sources, and they people talk about his prose is archaic and convoluted, and you might not know half the time what actually he's going on about. And I think I looked at this review of the graphic novel of At the Mountains of Madness, and they said you can now experience the thrill of H.P. Lovecraft without having to wade through his prose. The thing is, after I finished this story, which I had heard on the H.P. Lovecraft literary podcast, listened to, but I had never read it until now, at the end of it, I was like, wow, this guy was brilliant. He was, he was, his writing, and he wrote, I guess this is from 1917 or something, around there, 1919. When they talk about I read about how they talk about his prose is archaic. His prose was considered archaic even then. And I remember, or I read about that he had submitted, I guess, this story. What was the name of the magazine that this story was first submitted to? The horror magazine. I can't remember, because he's a short story writer. Lovecraft is primarily a short story writer, and this was, I think, his only novella. And he submitted it because he had his short stories regularly published in these
Astounding Stories.
Astounding Stories, correct. And apparently he submitted the novella to Astounding Stories, and it was rejected. And then he submitted it somewhere else. I can't remember. But I heard or I read, I didn't hear, that they had edited when his story was accepted, that there was such heavy editing. He was really, really angry about it because he liked to use the British spellings of his in his prose, and they kept changing that because it was very off-putting to people, to the readers. Anyway, I'm not going on necessarily about what happened, because we know because Mark did a beautiful summation. But I think that I have to be honest here, that his prose is can be very difficult. And there are many times I would read a paragraph And then I would wait a minute, let me go back and reread that. Wait a minute, let me go back and reread that. Wait, what was that? What was he saying? Even after the third reread. But I still did it. And and also I have also read that I mean, we know that H.P. Lovecraft was is really the great first horror writer. We wouldn't, you know, I mean, he was he adored Poe. I know that, but he's considered the first, I think maybe the first great sci-fi horror writer. And I've heard, again, through the grapevine, that he's the only writer that really scares Stephen King, who is not one of my favorite writers, but who has certainly written a lot of scary stuff. But anyway, here I am going off, but I think the thing that just threw me wasn't what was the prose itself, even though I feel like the story is phenomenal and I can see the brilliance. He really was brilliant. But I have to just say the story, I mean, the prose threw me off. And let me just say one other thing, and then we'll go on, you guys take over. And that is, the one thing that is brilliant about, that I think is most brilliant about him, is that he makes fear, like you were talking about, Mark. He makes you're afraid of an objective fear, of objective whatever thing, concept, existence, whatever. It's not subjective so much, except that one of the things that he talks a lot about through the story is, like, he'll use with Danforth, right? He used this language. Danforth was frankly jumpy. I'm quoting from somewhere in the Kindle version. Danforth was frankly jumpy and began making some offensively irrelevant speculations. Again, offensively irrelevant speculations about the horror at the camp, which I resented all the more because I could not help sharing certain conclusions forced upon us by many features of this morbid survival from nightmare antiquity. Now, that's another thing that struck me, is that when they were going through this mountain, this trail, this ancient city, that there was something about the horror of it that was being thrust upon their own imaginations. I mean, do you see the kind of weird relationship I'm trying to bring up? It's not simply I saw something horrible and it scared the shit out of me. It's something far more complex that was going on that makes the horror even greater and worse, because it's attacking your imagination and your ability to conceive what's going on. Anyway, that is really, I mean, I'm going to find better words to capture this concept I'm talking about, but that, I think, is what makes Lovecraft brilliant, is he talks about how fear, it's not just a matter of you see something and you're scared of it. It's something greater and more complicated. Anyway.
Yeah, that's the madness business. I mean, this is it's a lot of that internal psychology that's absent from the prose. That's very clinical.
Even deeper. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Anyway, so that's sort of my thought. Onward.
Well, so, I mean, that's all right. I guess I'm wondering what the point is. I usually don't ask that, and I usually don't care. But we don't do a lot with science fiction. And if it's pure science fiction, like speculative, or it's what I think in Dune, you know, if you read, I think it's the foreword of Dune, he says that this is an earnest attempt at prediction. Like, he's not making up the things, like he's believing it to be a possible reality, or it is an attempt to figure out something real. And so whenever we read this, you know, I wonder what is his point? I mean, does he suggest that this is really the truth? I mean, not that you could go there and find these cities, but that this is something worth taking seriously? I mean, I'm a little bit sympathetic.
He was one of the large parts of this story is a warning: do not go there. Do not go to the Antarctic. This is a warning story as well. Don't go there and look at this.
Well, as I read it, as somebody speaking.
I
was just going to say, as I read it, I didn't really think that he was taking, like he wasn't trying to say this is a real thing that's happening. I think he goes he goes through all of this to say that, kind of whatever you think is maybe not true. And that's sort of the horror of it all, is that we rely so heavily on what we think we know and science and our beliefs, and how we just sort of take them for granted. And he stumbled upon this other world that just undoes all of that, and just sort of like, oh, well, everything we thought we knew about anything, God or the universe or how we came to be, is all just made up. And I think that's unsettling. And I think the fact that we, on some level, realize through his writing that we can't really know things, that's the fear, right? That's the scary part. I personally have to just call out, I just wanted to know if anybody else had this issue, is that like he seems to have stumbled upon this sort of like cyclopean like museum of natural history, and has like some kind of a magical decoder ring, and he can understand everything through these pictographs that are on the wall in a matter of a few hours. And I thought, wow, it's really like, I just laughed at some points, and I'm just thinking, how am I supposed to buy into this? Because it feels really implausible that this would be, I mean, some of the things that he takes away about, communication, and down to like the things that they like to do, or the different kinds of ways that they decorate. I don't know. It just all seemed like, okay, well, how do you know this exactly? It seemed a little odd.
Yeah, I think that sorry, I just want to say, I think that gets more to it, Jennifer. The appeal to the unknown, that makes sense as like a driving force. Mm-hmm. I think that's getting to the crux of it, because whenever I'm reading this, if you're reading fantasy, and I think this is fantasy, I mean, there's something to be said, like, maybe ancient aliens is the answer. I mean, maybe that's really the truth. It's an interesting speculation. What's confusing or confounding about this is that he's using objective science to prove this. I mean, it's that this is a real tangible thing. It's not like an internal, a lot of horror movies are just about, the psychology, and they're often metaphors, for a family going through change, or the fear of losing, or something like that. And then something manifests and we can focus on that. But this is something that's real, and he's calculating it. I mean, one of the things you might miss from an animated version is the specificity. I wanted to really draw out, with centimeters and inches, all of the things he was saying, because he was so careful about it, in a way that, so Frankenstein, if you read Frankenstein, there's almost no science in it. The actual monster, it's just like, and then it happened, I figured it out. And there's no talk of any chemistry or biology. There's not real science there. But in this, there's a lot of, how'd you say it? Like,
Geology.
Not like anthropomorphic. Like really detailed, specific details that go into each description. And so there's a reality there about these monsters. And so for me, it would be scary if this were the truth and you found it. And that's a pretty big order for your story and your plot, to say that this is I still don't know what the point is, like, because is it just that he is a fearful Christian and this is like a backdoor way of talking about evil and a metaphysics? Or,
no, he's atheist.
Oh, really? Okay. So that's great. This is helpful. I don't know a lot about Lovecraft, and I think it's going to be important to get at. Again, if it's a fantasy, my question is, why are you having this fantasy? I get a power fantasy. I get, like sexual fantasy, but why this, and where's it coming from?
He was also a raging racist.
So Laura, was bringing up she was making a distinction between fear and something else. And, it just occurred to me what it sounds like, Laura was talking about was maybe, Heidegger's distinction between fear and anxiety, right? Where fear is a fear of a specific thing, whereas anxiety is sort of a fear of it's a sort of different experience. Yeah, that you don't even understand the world. I'm just looking it up on the Stanford Encyclopedia just now, and they explain it like, when I am anxious, I am no longer at home in the world. I fail to find the world intelligible. I think that's basically the mood that is trying to be created by this story.
That's an interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, so I read this as a radical decentering of humanity. That's kind of the theme of his whole work, that you might have, whether it's a traditional religious viewpoint or a sort of complacent scientism that, we can understand the world and everything is ordered and everything is driven by causal laws that ultimately we can understand. That I think he's rejecting both of those in his overall worldview. And so the fantasy here is to kind of have that proven, to discover that actually, geology and ancient history have been wrong, that there were whole cycles of the world that we were unaware of, that we don't know our own origins, that far from being created by God to be masters of this world, we are an accidental offshoot of these aliens created different life forms for food and for workers, and they sort of just let them evolve on their own. Unless they became troublesome, then they would eliminate them. But if they didn't become troublesome, they just let them evolve. So we're the descendants of some sort of experiment like that. He talks at one point about an ancient Australopithecine looking thing in some of the frescoes as being something that was there as a basically a pet, as a jest. So thinking of that we are not the kings of the world that we thought we were. I think that's kind of the I don't know, fantasy implies it's something that you want to happen, but obviously we have fantasies all the time that are not things that we want to happen, but it does relate to psychology in some way, that these are, one of the things I was thinking about in the context of our Kristeva episode was whether there's there's phenomenology that describes our experience, and as Daniel was talking about, Heidegger's phenomenology even kind of can get into the realm of explanations, where you're sort of giving things that are not just describe the surface contents of your experience, but you're positing structures that are sort of behind them. So Heidegger talks about hiddenness and things, and making the clearing of being, and sort of introduce this whole really flexibility in talking about phenomenology. Well, what if, and then you get even in later Husserl and Heidegger, and Kierkegaard, you're talking about maybe the life world, and these sort of talking about ontology, when you're not really talking about the world anymore. You're not talking about substances and attributes and the kind of thing Aristotle would talking about, but you're talking about extensions, projections of psychology. And so, what I think might be going on in this kind of fiction is looking at the sort of world that some part of our psyche is afraid might really be out there, and sort of and just expressing it as if it were fact. And so that's the fantasy, and that's the point. That's why it would be actually relating to deep human needs and desires, and not just purely something, a yarn someone spun. I mean, that you could talk about what makes adventure stories exciting, stories of however many leagues under the sea, or the entire discovering an underground world, these whole lost world fantasies. These are not just autonomous literary creations that evolve over time from one story to the next story to the next story. They do that, but they do ultimately have, why they stick around, why people are still making them, because they do have some relation to our psyche.
Go please.
I just have a question. As you read this, did anybody think, okay, there are things that came from some sort of, like somewhere out in the cosmos, they landed here on Earth and they did their thing. And then also simultaneously, we have our own life happening on Earth in other parts of the planet? Or did it seem, I wasn't clear about that in the story, whether it was like we evolved from whatever they brought here, or they came and there was also some sort of an evolution, because we have the whole, I mean, he only goes so many eons back in time, right? And we had life on the planet prior to that. So I guess, does anybody have any clarity around that?
No, but I think it's crucial. I mean, that's getting into where this story, I feel like, is stepping on my toes a little
I
bit.
remember a statement about it being pre-man.
Well, I mean, he talks about the Comanchean period, right? And it's like, this was around the time of the dinosaurs, and I don't know, it seemed like they came during a time period where there was already life on the planet. I don't really know if it's important or not important, but it seems like if there was already life here and we're sort of an offshoot of that life, it's a different thing than if we are like an evolution of this other thing that is from another planet.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's it.
I got the sense that this was pre everything, pre even the concept of existence. This was isn't there a line somewhere, or maybe I read someone said it, that they appeared at the time the moon?
Yeah,
that was shortly after.
So that must have been what I don't know the name of the meteor that is responsible for separating the moon from the Earth. Before that, there was the mass, and then you had this impact, and then the moon was separated from the mass of the Earth, and finding an orbit later on. And so that's deep time.
I also didn't get a sense that we evolved or had in any way had any connection to these Shoggoths and these elder, and these old ones.
So I'm just looking at the beginning of chapter 7.
Mm-hmm.
This is when he starts giving the big history of the world, basically. These things had gone through mechanized life on other planets, decided that mechanization is not very satisfying. They came here. It was under the sea, at first for food and later for other purposes. They first created Earth life using available substances according to long-known methods.
Yeah.
The more elaborate experiments came after the annihilation of various cosmic enemies. Okay.
So doesn't this undermine I feel like this doesn't give us as much as it does undermine science. I guess that's my issue. I can understand, having an objection to rational objectivism, but this would really change our understanding, and it throws Darwin under the bus. And I mean, or not, in that it's a symptom of a greater cosmic evolution. That fits the story of evolution still, but this specific thing that we're supposed to take, as truth. I mean, and the reason I'm stuck on this is because it's given to you as an objective scientific truth, and it's, telling that this is actually there. It's the latitude and the longitude and all that.
So with regards to Darwin, I mean, he says in at least page 39 of mine that these vertebrates, as well as an infinity of other life forms, animal and vegetable, marine, terrestrial, and aerial, were the products of unguided evolution acting on life cells made by the old ones, but escaping beyond their radius of attention. It's sort of like,
where was that? That's important.
I mean, that's page 70.
What chapter?
6 in mine, which is in chapter 7.
It's still in 7. Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's important. So basically, we are just the sort of ones that got away.
For an accident.
Okay, that's funny, and that's interesting, right? Because we think of ourselves as sort of the center of the universe, and we're really just sort of like the.
Well, we really aren't. I don't really think we are, even if we take into account our own scientific, knowledge. I don't think we are.
Yeah.
Can I just make a comment on this whole science thing? I mean, what's really weird about this is that this whole book wouldn't exist if there weren't this bizarre kind of compulsion towards scientific curiosity. So, number one, he's writing the book in order to prevent a subsequent expedition to go explore the Antarctic more. So that's how the entire book came into being, is to warn people off from this scientific curiosity. And number two, the whole motivating passion of the central characters is scientific curiosity, which constantly is forcing them to go explore these caves even more. And it's hilarious because they see the dead remains of Lake and his crew, and yet they don't. If I saw that and I was a scientist in the Antarctic, I would be like, okay, I'm done. I can go home now. But they're like, no. Number one, they don't even figure it out that the aliens killed them at the time. It's almost like that's a repressed kind of suspicion that they have, right? But then they keep on going on even after they figured it out, because they find traces of the aliens in the inner caverns. Even at that point, they're not like, okay, we're done. Like,
well, maybe they were pulled. Maybe they were pulled by a force that was beyond their control.
Well, they talk about it. So he says it so many times throughout the story. He tries to explain away, like, listen, I know. Here's the point where we should have turned around and gone home. Or,
right.
I know. I just can't even tell you this part of me that is, so drawn to looking at what we shouldn't look at. Basically, he calls attention to that throughout the story, acknowledging the fact that most people would think that you would turn around, but that it's, I think, a metaphor for what, what we do.
For fear and horror.
Like, we can't turn away. Like, when you watch a horror film, you're like, no, I can go to sleep now. If I don't see any more, I will be able to sleep for the rest of the, and I will not think about this in the future. But you still watch it with, it's like it touches something inside you that is there, and you just kind of like, there's a validation about it.
Well, I want to clarify, Daniel was saying the whole reason for this book is to warn. Well, the whole reason of this book, according to the fictional narrator, is to warn. The whole reason for this book, as Lovecraft wrote it, Lovecraft is obviously just a real fetishist about scientific exploration and Arctic exploration in particular, that he's just did so much research on what kind of planes they would use and how they would set up the camp. And so there's all this detail, even the fact that he's jumping from a geologist's point of view to a biologist's point of view, that I think he did the best research that he could do, not just in service of making a good story, but because he just honestly was a huge fan. Was hearing about Shackleton's and Scott's expeditions and things. I'm sure he was just riveted by that whole subject matter.
And that this story really, and all these kinds of stories, wouldn't have happened had it not been for the time period where, like, now we know every corner of the earth. I mean, maybe there's parts of the ocean that are still undiscovered, but we know so much more because of all of the technology that we have, which they just didn't know. So it really was a mystery, and it was just ripe for the taking in terms of creating this sort of science fiction around it, because there's so much that you could make up because they didn't even know what was there at all.
So you don't think this could have been written today?
Well, they would have to move it. They could still make it,
Like
under
Mars.
There's a giant under the surface of the of the Earth thing. But it is kind of a space story. You just have to make it an investigation of another planet or other dimensions or whatever. But it's exactly the same psychological motivation.
Given the time frame that he was writing, that may have been what he was trying to, searching to do. He's looking, and because we had, as you point out, Jennifer, we didn't have the kind of knowledge of this kind of exploration and of the world that we do now. But I still think, in a way, as a writer, I think H.P. Lovecraft is able to go beyond that, even because he creates. And it goes back to what you were bringing up, Mark, about maybe psychology, or maybe the fear, what our fear is, that somehow Lovecraft taps into far better, in my opinion, than Stephen King. But that there's something that's almost inexplicable that we can't even get a hold of, that Lovecraft, I feel, gets in connection with, in terms of how fear affects us, or we affect fear.
He has this good essay. H.P. Lovecraft wrote this essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature, and the first line is, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear." And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. So I think he just
That's
sort
good.
of latches onto that in all of his stories.
Well, in a way, though, if you think about it, that's what horror is. What is behind that closed
Yeah, the
door?
dread. I mean, that's like what he's
what
so
is it?
good at.
Which goes to the anxiety that Dan was bringing up. But I think Lovecraft even pushes it further. But in a way, yeah, that is kind of the center of any horror / fantasy.
Yeah, but the horror fantasy of this is that that there's something really to be worried about. That if you go and look, you will find Cthulhu, and that is like an objective scientific fact that you need to reckon with. And
I wonder at the end, we talk about the older ones or whatever they're called, and then the Shoggoths, but then it seemed like at the end there was something like greater than all of that, and it felt like the great evil. That's a separate character that they're referring to when they say, like, Danforth kind of was in the helicopter and he turns around and he sees this thing and it obviously sends him into madness. Did you guys get the sense that it wasn't just, one of the Shoggoths or the older ones, but it was this greater thing, this like force of evil?
Well, yeah, he says it's unrelated.
Yeah, it's not. It's like this mist, and it's kind of like. Did any of you guys watch the show Stranger Things? It's like there's this crazy demon in the sky that is formless, and it's just this great evil thing. It sort of seems like that's what he saw, and that seems like the horror of it all in the end. It's not, I don't know if it's that we are not what we think we are or where we came from, but rather it's this sort of like evil that's out there that is greater than all of us.
But the thing that fuels all of that is our imagination.
Yeah, there's a problem here that, like, it turns out none of this stuff is true. So what's the upshot of the story then?
Yeah, yes, exactly. What's the point?
Well, it's fiction.
Yeah, but there's a certain kind of fiction. I argue with my friend about talking about writing sometimes, and he likes fantasy and I don't at all. And like Lord of the Rings is cool, whatever. But there's something about like why this invention, there's something about this what if that I don't know what it gives you. Going back to Stranger Things, I think it doesn't, having seen like this first season of Stranger Things, I don't get what it's about, like why this underworld, and there's a kind of, we were talking about how, we could do this movie or we could do this story again. And the reason it was done in Antarctica at the time was because that was a black spot on the map we didn't have, and that was the unknown. And now that we have Google Earth, we could look around and see the Shoggoths or whatever, and that would seem reasonable. But we would have to invent some other unknown place, or we'd have to go to our next unknown. Right now, Mars was mentioned, or what have you. Even that is looking a little bit, we might know too much about Mars to be able to reckon this.
Already.
But but what that points out to me is that this is something that they're inserting into the unknown. It's not about the unknown. It's this. It's almost like you have to want that to be the truth.
I don't know. I think it's just an alternative. Like, I think it's just a concrete formation of the idea of the unknown. So like, if you read about Nietzsche, and he talks about all the different ways in which we have our beliefs and how they're so a part of the way that we think and we don't even realize it.
Right.
And it's like, he unsettles a lot of those. Like, he makes you feel unsettled about a lot of your beliefs. I think that's what this does. I think this kind of horror story isn't necessarily about, that there is the big evil thing out there, or whether Shoggoths exist, or whether it's in the Antarctic or whatever. It's just the idea that what we think we know is maybe not accurate. And that's an unsettling thing, because uncertainty is really like just a human drive that we have to be, that we want to be certain, and we want to know like where we come from. And I think like philosophy does that, just it unsettles you in the way that you start questioning what you think and you realize at the end of it, you don't know a lot. There's nothing you can really hang your hat on. It's a kind of like, this is a sort of nihilistic view of it, but
not incorrect.
Yeah, but like I feel like science is already grappling with that unknown, and it has a way of taking into account this system already. But it seems like he wants to throw that under the bus. Like he might respect it or fetishize the science, but this doesn't seem like he's furthering it. And maybe that okay, so this is a manifestation of the unknown. I think that's really good, but I wonder if that's something that we're putting on it rather. Like, does he think it's a metaphor? Is I mean, because you can imagine the story done another way where we have an unreliable narrator, and it's possible to think that this was all in the mind of someone else, and we're left with that and what he's imagining and how his imagination runs away with him and how he gets. And maybe Lake went nuts and, is sending back things. And we can imagine that at each step, it was just someone losing and going mad. And this is, and we get to see the internal mental contents of that. But we don't really, but there's this, that's not what we get. We get the inverse of that. And there's something to really be afraid of, actually. And it seems like that
And why does that bother you?
Because there's plenty of stuff to be worried about without a Cthulhu. Like there's lots of stuff to be worried about in the unknown, and people are able to grapple with that without this extra lay on. And that's how I see it. I don't know why you would want to make this, because it doesn't. Yeah, go ahead.
I just last night with my wife, we tried out this A Million Little Pieces show, which is one of those soppy dramas, and somebody died. It's people coping with suicide, and I'm like, why would I want to put myself through this? Like, I'm not going to watch any more of this, because like there are enough actual problems without taking on the emotional trauma of fictional people. But obviously that is a prime thing that drama is about, and that's like the most realistic kind of drama that you could want. And so the question you seem to be asking is the same thing. I think you've given a good argument, Nathan, for why this is fantasy and not science fiction, right? Because he's not saying what if we had this new, proposing in the way that hard science fiction does, a new a hypothesis about the way time and space really work, or about a new way that we could have propulsion or something like that.
What if we could run 1,000 miles? What is like 1,000 miles in an hour? What if we could do that on our feet? What would the world look like and run from that?
Yeah, he's not doing that. It is more of a fantasy of here's what, the crazy way things might be. I guess I do see one potential sci-fi sort of application, which is, there's an assumption that we are built so well, right? Humanity is in the same way that we think we're the center of the universe. We think we are the sort of optimally designed critters, that we don't have big claws, but we have these big brains. And we really, the most science fiction shows, when they posit aliens, there are more people with creatures with 2 arms and 2 legs, and the eyes near the top. And because this is all just the most efficient way that could possibly be. And I think in coming up with the very detailed anatomy of these aliens, he's actually suggesting, no, actually this combination of animal and vegetable that can survive frozen in the ice for thousands of years, and has all these. He seems to be trying to design what would actually be a more efficient in every way sort of being. That could be smarter. That could not have the sort of irrationality we do. They don't have sex. They reproduce by spores. So he says this affects their social life in interesting ways. That they group not according to biological family units, but according to, insofar as we can figure out by looking at the frescoes, sociability, and they have a socialist system, perhaps, and he acknowledges, I take Jennifer's point, like that was a stopping point for me. Like, how could you get all this information out of the frescoes? But, they emphasize kind of the preternatural skill that is in these frescoes, that they, in fact, they convey things that, we could see when we were looking at it, that we didn't even quite have the sensibilities to make the most out of the stories, but like that we're just unusually, crazily, indescribably effective in transmitting this stuff. And, coupling that with him saying, we're uncertain from looking at it whether they really were socialists or not. It was enough on second reading, at least, that I was able to buy it.
Yeah, I should have read it a second time.
So I guess let me draw another distinction here. What's the difference between this and Gulliver's Travels? I mean, that's a, I'm putting it out there as a kind of rhetorical question. But I mean, if you think about the idea of a traveler going into strange lands and seeing different things, the effect that makes, in my opinion, Gulliver's Travels like good fiction is that it's exploring something through a metaphor that we're not supposed to take it that there's horse people. It's a lens that we can see things more clearly through. And I don't think this gives us that tool. It's
No, I think it actually. I was thinking about this a lot, and it's weird how much these zucchini alien monster things are compared to like the decline and fall of Western civilization. I don't. It's literally like we see over and over again. He's like comparing it to Constantine. He keeps on describing how these aliens underwent a period of decadence where all their great carvings kind of lost all their style over time. And it's very weird how towards the end, he even says, he even compares the aliens to men. They say they kind of admires them in a funny way because they managed to survive so long. And he says, the narrator says, they were men. And it strikes me that there's some sort of allegory about human civilization going on here as well, at least with regards to the aliens. And maybe there's something to the fact that, the aliens that Lake accidentally woke up apparently were killed by the Shoggoth or whatever, however you pronounce it, which, in the Shoggoth, just to explain as a reminder, is they were basically like the slaves of these aliens back in the day. And somehow or other, one of them survived, I guess, in the caverns. And so when the aliens who were woken up by Lake went back into the caverns, apparently, I think the Shoggoth must have killed them. And then we have the scene at the very end where the narrator is being chased by a Shoggoth. And I mean, to my mind, there's some sort of comment on human civilization going on here.
Yeah, I think so too, especially when they talk about the the unintended intelligence of the Shoggoths and sort of how it seemed to get a little out of control. And I thought it felt like a commentary on technology. I'm not sure if it was meant to, but there's a lot with, and I'm trying to find the exact quotes, but he talks about, here it was. It says, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, and more amphibious, more and more imitative, great God. And he talks about these guys, these Shoggoths, in this way. And it just makes me think about the way that our technology becomes sort of like a reflection of our darker nature.
So can I also make another suggestion?
What kind of technology I'm sorry, Dan. What kind of technology would he be thinking about in 1919?
I don't know. I think that's interesting, right? I think there are a lot of people wrote a lot of great things about technology well before we had the technology that we have today.
Technology, yeah.
The instruments of death in World War I.
Okay.
Right? Every time you have a war and they have more and more horrible things and talk about how people are just, we're getting too technologically advanced relative to our wisdom.
Right.
That's apparently an old theme.
Okay. All right. Fine. But one thing, when we talk about finding, like you keep searching for, Nathan, and is a metaphor, if there is a metaphor in this book on the part of H.P. Lovecraft. When we look for that sort of thing, one of the ways to do that is to look at the author, right? And who the author is and what they've written before and what they're known for, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things, sadly, that he is most famous for is what a raging racist he was. He was a
Yeah.
major racist.
But I think that's not very clear in his writing. I think that's one of those things where you almost have to put it aside. And I know that's hard to say because
It's hard.
it is a big deal. I don't know. I feel like that it's like one of those things where if you undermine an author, then everything becomes irrelevant and then you just lose everything.
No, I
So
agree.
I'm sure he was I'm sure he was. There's a lot of documentation for that. But, you know, he was also just like mentally unstable in a lot of ways too. So
Yeah, and he was a loner, and he was poor for a lot of his life.
and he married a Jewish woman who, I mean, I don't know.
I don't know that marriage didn't work out too well, right?
I don't know. I just think I tried to find out where the racism was, and I didn't read his other stuff.
As I understand, it came from when he was living in New York, you know, and the large immigrant population. I don't know.
It's just it's part of his fear. So like if the point is to express, if his writing is to express different ways in which we are afraid, and he was definitely tapping into a fear. He wasn't necessarily commenting on it. He was participating in it, but he was still accurately expressing, you know, it's not so clear in here because the aliens here are superior to us. But yeah, it is in a lot of his other things, like in Cthulhu, you can hear a discussion about that where he's describing what kind of person are the worshipers of Cthulhu. You know, they're always half-breeds or Negro seamen or you know, Negro sailors or something like that. So yeah, it does. He's very afraid of where the human and the animal, you know, the ways in which humanity could be degraded. And you know, Daniel did refer to in here how the picture of the fall of Rome, the picture of how these creatures are getting degraded. So I guess you could see the Shoggoths as something like that they are, you know, it is a story, basically a robot story, an AI going out of control kind of thing. But you could also, you know, take, you know, it is, these guys were slave owners. They created these Shoggoths to be their servants, and they're and they imitate them. And so that's like part of the horror at the end is for some reason we've gotten used to the fact that the zucchini aliens make these flute-like sounds. You know, they've heard them on the wind. And just as the zucchini aliens, even though they were the boogeymen, have become mere men, have become something you can identify with. The ultimate horror when they're being chased by the Shoggoth is the Shoggoth is making the noise, this kiki-li-li, which is the flute-like sound that they imitated from their masters. And they were running into these. They've been seeing these frescoes carved into the walls throughout the city. Well, as they get down to where the Shoggoth is around, they find these really crude ones. You know, they've been noting how they've gotten more and more crude over the thousands and thousands of years that the civilization was around. But like, these are so crude, they're obviously, at least to my mind, they don't say this out loud, but like, it's the Shoggoths themselves that have become enough like their masters, you know, have tried to take over, that they are making these carvings themselves and sort of, you know, maybe reframing the narrative to make themselves the heroes. Who knows? So that could very much express Lovecraft's potential racism, like that these things that were our slaves could rise up and slay us and, you know, take over our culture, but in this bastardized way.
Right.
Yeah, and so I've got a couple of we're getting really into it, and I have nice things to say, but I want to keep about the story, but like I want to keep slagging on it for just a little bit because I don't. So I think the racism claim is actually important. Not so I didn't glean it from the story either. I don't know about his other works, but I think those are good examples, Mark, about, you know, how you can see this peeking through. But there's a technical reason why racism would be important, because that's your understanding about evolution. Like, you would have to think that there is an order or some kind. That's why I asked if he was a Christian, because if you have so like Stephen King, I can see through Stephen King a little more clearly knowing he's a Christian. It gives you a certain kind of supernatural thinking, and that can pervade lots of things, whether it's expressed or not. A lot of times in cute movies, there'll be something like a wind blows, and that's God, right? But you don't have to say it because everybody believes in God in modern audiences. So it's just like a wink. But here, I mean, if we're really talking about the evolution and forms, and thinking about things, then it's indefensible because there is not a perfect design. That's a part of evolutionary understanding. And so, you know, there's a way that the science that he could be contributing to science fiction, like you said, Mark. This could be a real play to, say, ancient aliens. And that's a possibility. I mean, it's possible that life started elsewhere and came here. It's not a fact. I don't run with it. I think about it, you know, and leave it as a possibility, but I don't operate under that understanding and then think about what that must mean for me and the world and how we do things. So I guess what my criticism is that I think this is really flowery, bad thinking, but that's where I'm at. And I wonder if you guys
So
haven't. Yeah.
what is your, okay, so why is it bad thinking? Just one more time. What is the bad thinking about it?
Yeah.
Well, the literalism of a monster would be the bad starting place. The supernaturalism. I mean, you can explore a power fantasy by giving someone flight, but the difference between that and all other fiction is that you cannot really fly. That's impossible. It's not that it's implausible. We can read a story about a wealthy person, and I'm not wealthy, but that's in the realm of reality as we understand it. And he's seeming to say something else about reality that bothers me, because it actually stops thinking a little bit. Like if you think that it's ancient aliens, then you kind of have your answer, and it's not as messy and it's not as interesting as the real unknown story, which we don't know, I think.
I feel like you should read, you know, maybe for this podcast or Tolkien's essays on fairy stories, because you know you're just giving a global condemnation of anything that's not basically realistic fiction or you know tied in the way that hard science fiction would be.
Well, but again, the Gulliver's Travels would be another example. There's something going on there. There's metaphor or allegory, like, you know, Animal Farm. You can put your character in the mind of a pig. That's cool. And that's not realistic, but you're achieving something at a distance by not playing in reality as we know it. And this doesn't do that. It's written into a real understanding in a way that I think a lot of people are apologizing for Lovecraft when they say, oh, he's talking about this other stuff, that that's an allegory or it's a metaphor. I'm not sure that it is. And that's where I have an issue.
I agree. It's not an allegory or metaphor, I don't think.
So what about the idea that, you know, if you read this and you're like actually putting yourself in the place of Dyer and you're going through this, I mean, let's suspend our disbelief and say, okay, we're seeing this and this is all reality to us. And it's believable enough in the story as he tells it. Let's just assume that all what he's saying is like, you're really going to be unnerved by the fact that you're just like, the world as you know it is not, you know, it's like, there's just everything that you've based your life on, or everything that we've based our knowledge on, and everything we've based what we believe on and how we operate in the world is not real. That's a real possibility. I mean, there's nothing unreal about that. Like all of our morality is sort of like just it's not really tethered to anything. I mean, I think that's like a huge question philosophically that this story calls out. And I think that's really the scary, horrible part. I don't know if that's not a metaphor or if it's not an allegory, but it's certainly what happens. I mean, when you read the story, you're like, oh, geez, what if that's really true? Like, what if it were true? Obviously, it's very unlikely, but it's not impossible. I mean, that's the point, right? That it's,
well, I mean, I would argue that it is impossible because you can't go there and find it, or that that it's not really there. That in a way that, you know, you can look and you can find someone who's been divorced, and you can therefore have a story about that in a way. I guess the issue is that it's positively saying something. It's not looking at negative space and talking about the unknown in the psychological way that I think is interesting. It's saying that because of this, and I think it actually gives an answer where it doesn't it doesn't deserve to be able to give that answer. It's kind of like positing a god, and that there's an ancient alien race that is the reason and origin of things, and that's a positive claim.
So, I mean, it strikes me that I think this is some sort of obviously he's not suggesting that there really were ancient aliens as far as I can tell, but I think that there is some idea here that the universe really isn't different. Humans aren't the center of the universe. It's a bit like at the end of the book of Job, where God talks from the whirlwind, and he's kind of like, fuck you, Job. You're not the center of the universe. Look at this freaking Leviathan. Look at this freaking beast, right? And I mean, I think that's kind of what he's getting at with this silly story. If I had to guess,
I mean, he can make you feel
isn't
something.
that kind
Sorry, go
of
ahead.
Truth?
But again, like that's evocative, and I get it. Like a jump scare will get me, but I think it's cheap. You know what I mean? Like I get that you can make me feel something, and if I do choose to believe you and go along with this, what if? Then yes, I have to believe the story and the words that you're reading. But the way I separate it out is that this is not something that I'm just not sure what the value of it is.
So I think I know what you're going for, that you're kind of saying that it's soulless. And, I've heard it said that, what makes literature good is that there's some reality to it. Now, I would say the reality could come on any level, right? That what makes this good in that respect is the fact that you're hearing this as if, it's not just describing what's going on in the mind of this guy, right? You might think that Stephen King is a much more intimate kind of horror because it's always, what's that? It's not first person, it's third person focused on a particular character. I don't remember what the literary name for that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I take your point.
But yes.
Free and direct discourse.
Yes. So there's a lot of, Stephen King loves to put the underlying forbidden thought that somebody's having in italics. Like that is throughout almost every single damn one of his books, is that the thing that the person doesn't want to admit to themselves, the other voice that, chimes up in italic, that requires a so close intimacy. And so there's a certain realism, verisimilitude in that you're kind of giving an x-ray into the human mind, but this is a more straightforward kind of realism, like an actual scientific dispatch. This is just what
it's more
Lovecraft
technical.
was a fan of. Yeah. And so you do get that it could be an unreliable narrator, but he's giving all these technical, realistic details of how things would go down. And then even in I would say that actually, I think he admits that the frescoes themselves, like those aliens could be unreliable narrators. Like they're giving the story of their civilization, and kind of making themselves grandiose. What would it look like from? This is why I mentioned that the Shoggoths themselves, when they become intelligent, would have a different perspective on this whole stream of events, or the various things that they come into contact with, or they see themselves. So I don't know that this history is just being laid out, either that what Dyer is saying or what he's relating are in the frescoes. I don't think that those are necessarily, being given just straight up as facts. They're being given in the realistic, unreliable sort of way that you would get from people. But I, so that's what makes it, part of what makes it quality literature in terms of, if you define quality literature in terms of realism. But what you're saying, Nathan, is that ultimately when you get down to what they're discovering, that he's not discovering some deep truth about the human soul.
Right.
He's discovering this fantasy that he's invented.
Right.
Yeah, and you can get on board with that fantasy if you choose to. Yeah.
Well, and I think to some extent he's trying something different. That what he's famous for, as I was saying, whether in Cthulhu or other things, is to say is really to emphasize how unreliable the narrators are. To have the narrators always say, "I could have been going mad. We could have been making this up." I mean, the guys say that here, but like they're also very meticulous here in a way that some of his other narrators are not. So, I think leaving the unknown as unknown, like that's part of what makes a lot of Lovecraft so true, is because there really is, just in the way we talk about in this objection episode, that the thing that we're fundamentally afraid of is, as Daniel was talking about, this unfocused anxiety. And so to actually clarify some of that and posit these zucchini aliens and describe them in detail does seem to demystify it. It seems to make it less good. And I think that maybe Lovecraft realized that, and that's why he lays on this extra layer of the more horrible mountains that are beyond the mountains. And, you know, there's still a whole vast unknown that you can
Yeah, it's a punt.
tap into.
But I think in a way that increases the horror of it, not the badness of the story, but the horror to the reader and the horror to their experience, is because if you're writing something that's soulless, as you refer to it, Mark, then it takes it out of our control. Like, in other words, he's telling you something very technical, very black and white, very, basic, and this is what's happening. And it's real, and in a way that's more frightening, because if it's somehow, if we look at a Stephen King story, or even think about, like, let's say that this story was some sort of metaphor that Lovecraft is trying to discuss or bring forward, then that would theoretically go to whatever is within the reader, the human soul, the human heart, the human something within the reader. And then the fear that you have, like knowing that you can, at the end of the movie, you're going to leave the theater and won't have that shocking thing, around you anymore. You're escaping it. That you can somehow, if this story is a metaphor, you can somehow control your reaction to it, or have control over the fear that you have. But if he's being just straightforward, technical, very straight like this, no metaphor, no soul, then the fear, I think, is even worse. The horror is even greater, because it's beyond our control.
Yeah, so I guess we're just using the soul. I was using as a way of expressing what Nathan was saying was the truth of something. But
yeah, no,
you could certainly have a soulless entity and posit that to be, there's a certain psychological truth about the fear of that the universe is ultimately soulless and doesn't care about us. And so there's truth, there's soul in the idea of soullessness in that sense. I don't want us to get confused.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's, there's, so the truth of this would be the evocative emotional response that you can get out of it, I suppose, if you believe it. You can experience an emotion of fear, but but I'm not sure that's like anyway, yeah, I want to step back, because I feel like I'm not sure if I've made a solid point here or not, or if this is maybe personal taste, but I guess I would just say that there's something like in Ghostbusters, where you have, in a lot of pop horror movies, you see that they go in with their wave detection meters and they have their cameras, and or House of Leaves would be a better example. Mark Danielewski, I think, is the author. And if you read that is an exploration that goes psychologically and also literally. His house is larger inside than outside, and there's a tunnel that goes into a darkness that is a cavern inside of his house, and it shouldn't be that way. And so you've got this it's maybe a trope of people who are rational scientific people. There was one that came out with Hilary Swank, and she was an atheist scientist, and she went to a town, but there were really locusts attacks, and God really existed. And so she had to, eat her atheism and truck with it, because that was the reality that was created. And so I feel like a lot of times people like to wear the vests of, other professions to kind of give so bringing in all the science, it lends weight to it that I think is undeserved. Just like with horror movies that want to presume that they know about science and then give you a supernatural truth.
To go to your point, Nate, it does strike there. When I was reading this, for some reason, I was reminded of the sermon "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" by Jonathan Edwards. I feel like there's an element of some sort of revenge going on here in this book, which maybe is part of the reason why we have ethical qualms here. I don't know. I mean, this is just a suspicion, and maybe it's just speculation, but obviously this guy hated people. He had a generalized misanthropy, I guess you could say. And, is this some sort of weird revenge on us? I don't know.
No, I know what you mean. Like, I guess an extreme form of what I'm saying would be that this guy is hating science and abusing it, in this, that, he's pretending or walking around in the clothes of this thing in order to dash it at the end. And that's, and maybe not, I honestly would have more respect for this story if he really is saying that we came from ancient aliens, because that's a posit. That's at least, that's something that I can truck with. It's a maybe, it's a what if. That's science fiction still. That's working with what we know.
But I think the idea is that, it's not that we really come from ancient aliens. It's like this is creating in you this feeling of kind of dread and horror and anxiety, and it probably has something to do with our real fate in the universe. One thing I learned recently was that the most likely, there are so many ways that we can just be wiped off the face of the earth, like in a gamma ray burst. Like apparently there's this thing where if a star that's nearby explodes the wrong way, we can basically be wiped off of the face of the earth, right? And also I recently learned that the way that the universe ends is just so stupid. It's at least one theory of it is just all the stars go out, then there's black holes, and the black holes slowly shrink to nothingness, and then there's just nothing except for straight protons, but even then the protons decay slowly over time, and it's just such a stupid ending. And I don't know, I mean, maybe this book is kind of the fairy tale version of all those shitty things that are going to happen to us eventually. I don't know. I mean,
well, let me say, I mean, you can have two different, I mean, if you want existential dread, then you can take that the universe is convoluting itself and we have no idea of knowing which version. We don't even know how many times this has happened. We don't know which Matrix version we're living in. And it's just happening, and it'll happen, it'll convolute again, and then we'll have a new universe and we can't interact with that. And, so thinking about a permanent place in the world, that's one thing, and you can have a dread there, or you can have dread by believing in hell. That taps into the same thing. But what I'm saying is that the hell or the Cthulhu, it's an unjustified emotional response. You can feel that way, but it's not useful unless you want to, use, the usefulness of controlling people, and here maybe since we are, a fairly new group, maybe my, I don't call myself an atheist, but I guess that's what it is, that's coming across, and it might be, so anyway, that's just my point of view. I'm not apologizing for it or anything like that, but it might, but that's where this is coming from.
You were also going to say something nice about the story.
Oh yeah, yeah.
As I recall.
Sure. Well, I don't want to take it. I'd like, you if anybody else has other things they want to say, I'd like to give that air here, because there's some, the language is really cool. He did need an editor. And I think it's hilarious that he thought he didn't, because
didn't like it.
Because one of my favorite lines, I'll save it, but he used it 3 times. And it was the first time it was, wow, what a piece that is. But to hear it come out again and again, it just seems, again, just disordered thinking, or, how many times are we going to hear cyclopean or pyramidal and
cyclopean all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But anyway, so let me, maybe we can start to close this chapter here, but I'd like to defer to you guys. If there's any other things that are pressing about it or striking.
I just feel like I should almost give a defense of.
You feel like you have to give a defense of Lovecraft?
not of Lovecraft in particular, but just of the idea.
I feel like I have to defend fiction.
Right. Well,
Well, no,
this whole
fiction is. I just want to clarify between there's things that are not real, and that's fiction, and there's also fantasy. Both of them are not real, but there's a difference in their plausibility. And again, you can't
And you
fly.
just have the problem with fantasy.
As far as good literature, again, if you want to have a good time and just read a book and feel something, go ahead. That's cool. Whatever.
Wait. Can I suggest a different approach to the objection that you're making? I think what the core of your real complaint here is that when you read a book, regardless of whether it's realistic or not, it kind of acts on your emotions and sort of ethically orients you one way or another. Like Samuel Beckett, for instance, goes over a lot of similar territory of like the universe doesn't care about us, everything sucks, blah, blah, blah. But like his whole kind of ethical orientation is like we have to go on, right? Like we have to somehow resolutely meet this challenge. Shakespeare says the readiness is all, in his horrible tragedies, right?
Right.
And here it's just like, okay, what's next, right? Like there's a funny sort of thing where, it's just hard to know what the ethical upshot of this is. It's not a matter of like, oh, maybe I was throwing us off by saying, this isn't real, who cares, right, earlier on. But like the real objection here is just like, what is the ethical upshot of this stuff, to my mind?
Perhaps. I mean, I'm not trying. I don't think moralizing literature is the way, or that's the only way to go for something, or it's only good. And so, but maybe ethics is. I think I can see your point, though I might be able to parse those words a little bit. But Mark, maybe you can chime in here too. I didn't want to take you off your fantasy defense.
I'm grateful that he didn't say there are some things man was not meant to know. Literally, even though that is, in an indirect way what the narrator is saying, but even what you are supposed to be thinking as a reader, right? The narrator has described this in such awesome ways that there's no way that anybody would read this and be like, oh yes, we'll take your advice and never go down there at all. No, it's like we'll go down there, but we'll bring more guns. Like
yeah, that's the fantasy too.
We can take out a friggin' Shoggoth. We can, because as far as there's all these awesome ruins that you could study for months and months and months. Just be careful that you don't thaw out anything, and don't go down those particular tunnels that have been preternaturally that have been obviously cleaned by the Shoggoths running over them. There's debris everywhere, but they get to a certain part of the tunnel where it's spotless. There's not even dust here. Like if you see that, go back. So that's the only specific things that I think that would get out of there. I mean, the point about fancy, you're bringing up Gulliver's Travels a couple times. Nathan was making me think of the difference between that and anybody read the Oz books plural as a kid?
No.
For some reason, those were like a staple in our house, even in the Wizard of Oz book itself, but more so in the subsequent books. They're like, he wrote like 9 of them. There's a lot of just traveloguing that's very much influenced, I think, by the different, by Gulliver's Travels and the different kind of creatures that he runs across. And it's very much like, okay, now we're meeting the teacup people, and you got to be careful when you're around the teacup people, because if you kick them, they're going to break. Like, so it's very much, there's no, there might even be some explicit like social moralizing, like people, so sometimes there's, explicit, like, people should be less busybodies. Like there's kind of lessons in moralizing and whatever, but like it's really mostly just to be a fun little thing that kind of captures your imagination a little bit. And I guess I'm trying to think of like, I can think of a lot of arguments against that, sort of Kierkegaardian, people get their whole imaginations captured by the Star Wars universe or the Marvel universe or something. And you could definitely see that as sheer escapism, like that there really is no positive social value through that. It just makes you consumers. It just sucks you into these imaginary worlds. but I don't know. There's something I'm trying. So it would take me longer to formulate what the response is from that. That there's, that drama is fundamentally one of the things that we need. And if you have to drama, if it's mere fantastical drama, that's still serving a vital human need. And I don't know, people being excited about anything, geeking out about anything, I feel like is a healthier way to live life than being very blah and drab and judgmental and snobby about exactly what kind of entertainment is morally uplifting or not.
Yeah, well, again, morals, I'm not sure. It's just, it's not exactly, yeah, I don't want to put fiction into too narrow of a box here, because there's different kinds of truths that you could get at. And I think that a moral truth is one of those. I'm not sure what any truth comes out of this, besides, again, just being evocative. And and I've laid out, the cases for those different kinds of things. But I mean,
well, I mean, the different works speak to everybody in different ways. I mean, different people are going to get, that's just the nature of art and the.
There is a critical thing. I mean, there certainly is superior work, right? I mean, it's not just.
In your opinion.
But no, I was putting that forth that Gulliver's Travels versus Oz example as objectively, Gulliver's Travels is just way, way better literature than this.
Yeah.
There's still something enjoyable about the other thing, and it's foolish to reject things that are enjoyable in the world globally because you're sort of concerned with something that is more deep and more important. Like I feel like you should enjoy things on all levels, but yeah, you can still acknowledge what is, whether I don't know that this is great literature in the way that Samuel Beckett is. It's just not.
No.
Yeah, I don't think he has. Oh, I don't think he has. Like, I don't think he's a great writer. I think he's actually kind of a bad writer in a lot of ways. But I think he has these great ideas. It's almost like Star Wars, He's got these amazing ideas, and they're so interesting and they're so intriguing, and what they mean and what you can take from them is awesome. But just the way that he conveys it is really hard to get through at times. It's very clunky, like you said, and the amount of extra verbiage that he uses seems totally unnecessary. And the amount of technical words that he used in the book was, really hard. It was off-putting. And the amount of time that it took him to get to a point was difficult. I mean, I like the idea. Like when I first started reading it, I was like, oh wow, I can't wait to find out what's next, and then I was like, and now I still can't wait to find out what's, and I just kept waiting. And then right before something would happen, he would sort of say, all right, I really hesitate to give you the full story. I really don't want to say it. And you're just like, just say it already. So he did a really good job with that, but it was annoying. I think it was like too far. And maybe that's just because, I just read a lot of stuff that's very instantly gratifying. I don't know.
Well, it could have been also the time of when he was writing. I mean,
well, that's just why I thought that you guys would probably like, some of his shorter fiction better than this. That I think he's building on himself over time. This is fairly late in his career, and he, had to build to something of this length.
And he's basically a short story, right?
He had done the get to the point thing enough times that I think he just was trying to challenge himself and have something more immersive.
Right.
Did you read this after you had read some of his other stuff, Mark, like the Call of Cthulhu?
Yes, the Call of Cthulhu and
we read that.
Like 4 other stories I read, in pretty quick succession, and then I was like, I should brave this. And when I started this again, I was kind of, oh, well, I don't know. This is maybe a little more pain than people want to go through.
More pain.
Do you think that it helped to have read those other stories? Because it did feel like this is, there were a few references in there, and when I looked them up, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is really from, like, maybe these characters were fleshed out in other stories a little bit better, so that this felt like you're reading, book 2 of a series or something like that.
Mm.
I had some of the references, and the fact that I'm reading this annotated version, so when he talks about the plains of Lang, just all these things where he's describing what Danforth says about the glimpse that he saw of what this horrible, it's not even necessarily a figure. It's not necessarily like in Stranger Things, like, a giant monster that they see,
right.
like that. But it's even just beholding, like in Call of Cthulhu, beholding the city of R'lyeh where Cthulhu lives, like that drives you mad because it's non-Euclidean, and
Right.
so there's just accursed places, and so yeah, I was familiar with some of this just from him talking about Cthulhu and stuff, but a lot of it, the references are to short stories. I don't know that it helps. In fact, I kind of like, again, I like it more mystified, and the fact that he says, oh yeah, they're because Cthulhu in that story is sort of a thing that really you can't even, it doesn't exist entirely on this plane, and you can't really have an image of it. And even though there's a boat that runs physically into the monster, it sort of reforms in this way that lets you know that it's just a basically indescribable thing. And so by filling in the historical detail, I don't know that he helps the dread of that mythos.
And I think he talks about this idea that like these are things that are not, that we can't comprehend. Like although he comprehends,
like he says, he can't describe them.
Yeah, and that he can comprehend so much from these pictographs or whatever, but yet he does say it's somewhere in the book that it's beyond our comprehension, it's beyond our understanding. And so it's this unknown kind of sort of energy, weird, I don't even know what to call it. So as a writer, I think he does convey that there's some level of otherworldliness, but that can't be put into words. I mean, how do you put into words what can't be put into words? I think that's what he's trying to do. It's just really hard to do.
Just use the word cyclopean over and over again.
Yeah,
over and over again. That's funny. It's true.
Okay. Well, Mark, maybe we can table a fantasy and all that later. But Dan, please.
I also wonder how much you could maybe look at this as a sort of like exposure therapy type paradigm, right? Where people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, like in order to get them to get over in order to cure them, you have to sort of expose them to the exact things that were stressing them out in a sort of controlled atmosphere over time. And I don't know, maybe you could view that as the implicit benefit of a story like this, even if it's just completely implicit and maybe not exactly what even he intended.
Well, and that kind of ties into where I would go into praise, because I've written down a list of things that I think are spiritually inspired by this, like The Thing, or Aliens, or maybe Scientology, Annihilation is another work of, but I don't like it, it's another one of those group of scientists go into a region that's, radically transforming because of an alien impact that's mysterious, and, it's taken with all of this, again, this trope of having a known entity. It's just like in horror movies, you have your cell phone at first, and then they strip this stuff away from you until you're just naked and powerless in front of something. And that's a feeling. Though, it certainly inspired a lot of things that I find interesting, but Aliens, it's maybe a great film, but I'm not sure that it has that, not utility or usefulness or worth of, fiction, but I don't know that it's adding anything into our human understanding about the way things go. But there's certainly a lot of cool stuff that must have been inspired by this, because he's really given a lot to work with.
Oh, he was the beginning of it all. In terms of horror writing, sorry.
Well, one of his characters talks about Poe also, and that he had been like a reader of Poe. And that's actually a good distinction. I think that Poe is that's great fiction, and that's got something truthful to tell you about a lot of things. And part of that is because it deals with the internal psychological mind, the thinking that something is happening. And that's fine. You can, I'm not saying that you can't have outrageous stuff in your fiction, but if you're going to have demons walking around, it's probably a better thing if it's in someone's mind, or that's what they're seeing, because that's actually what's happening. It's an invention, and to show and to couch that in a way that doesn't say that I also believe in demons, I feel like is important for what I'm trying to get stuff out of fiction, which is the truth, whatever that is.
Well, I don't know if it's like against the rules to bring in secondary literature, but I do have to say, I think you would really like his essay on supernatural horror and literature. And he says, because our feelings toward the beneficent aspects of the unknown have been first captured and formalized by conventional religious rituals, it has fallen to the lot of the darker and more maleficent side of the cosmic mystery to figure chiefly in our popular supernatural folklore. So I think he just is taking this kind of darker aspect of the unknown because he feels like religion has that's what religion does, is take, a sort of more benevolent view of the unknown and concretize it. And I think what this does is just the opposite, because there are, if there is this benevolent view of the unknown, then there has to be this other darker side. And I think he's just tapping into that. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I would say this is really good then if you give it to creationists to read, and that can shake people up. It seems like this is good in certain environments, like that makes sense if you come from if you have a view of the world that does have that beneficent order. But the thing that gets on my, nerves a little bit about it is that all the concern about the unknown and science is really being done by scientists, and it's really something to tackle. And this is a kind of like a panacea for that. It gives an answer for something where the not answer is more interesting. And the answers that we get out of it are more interesting than the answers that are being provided by the, Starhead thing.
I'll acknowledge that there can be literature that is just based on a lie. That whereas you're looking for psychological truth or truth on any level, so like the Left Behind books, I've of course never read them, but I'm familiar and I've seen a little bit of one or other of the movies, and that just that's fundamentally based on, it's not speculative. What if it were true? If that the people will get pulled up in the rapture and the rest of us would be left behind. It's not speculative in that way. It's just kind of stating it like a fact. And yeah, I find something deeply offensive about that. And if you're seeing this as a version of that, I can see why you would have a problem with it. But I don't see this that way. I see it as more whimsical than that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could have been anything. Like, it could have been any other version than what we know as reality. It's just, this is sort of like a contrast to what we think we know, and it could have been anything else. And obviously, it has a sort of dark and evil slant to it because it's horror, and that's provocative and interesting to read. But I think that's one of the other things that I would have liked to, or maybe we can discuss a little bit, is the idea of, why do we like to read horror? Like, as a people, why do we like what is horrible? I mean, I wasn't actually scared. I took a little bit of time to say whether or not I could read this book with you guys, because I thought, oh my gosh, I can't. I know myself, I will not be able to sleep, because I'm thinking of Stephen King, and I'm thinking of so many things that I've read that are just like, they never left me, and I do not read that stuff anymore. And this was not that. This was not scary in that way. It was more like existentially scary, I think, like the way that philosophy is, when you start thinking about things, you're like, oh my God, I know nothing. But it wasn't actually horrifying. Even with all of its sort of like, talk of disgusting things, like the stench of this and it just, I don't know if it's because it was so long ago and I'm so desensitized because of all the horrible stuff we watch on television, but it was not scary in that way. It was intriguing. And I wondered if anybody else felt that it was scary, or why you're drawn to horror.
Yeah, for me, horror is just a tone. And I like certain tones. So like The Sixth Sense or something, and it's a lot of it has to do with the cinematography and the soundtrack, and just kind of brooding about the unknown and stuff like that. That there's a certain pleasing tone to that for me. But no, I didn't. And in fact, I don't like things that actually have jump scares and things that would physically make me ill and stuff like that. Like, that's not what gets me off. It's more this brooding existential dread that it's something appealing about it.
One thing I did like, I mean, toward that a little bit, is he builds up some really good tension in the beginning, which I found, which can go into a scary thing, but it doesn't get scary. I see your point, Jennifer, but he does build up, I think, really good tension, like about what, and maybe he goes on a little too long. I don't know. I mean, I think one of the reasons you may not have been so scared is, again, we're used to the way certain things are laid out in books now. It's different. This is from 1919 or whenever it was that he wrote it. So that's one thing. But I do think he really does really good tension in the beginning of the book.
I think that's what the realism part is, what I liked about it so much, actually, because you're first reading this book and you're hearing all of it. Reads very much like if somebody were interviewing you post traumatic event, like from NASA or something. I don't know, some kind of very documentary kind of interview. And the way he goes on and on in the book, he talks about so much of the science, and it feels like very realistic. You're just taken into a very realistic world. There's you don't have this pretense of otherworldliness. So then when it does happen, when you do find out that it takes this dark turn, it's jarring in a way that it wouldn't be if it wasn't so grounded in realism in the first part of the story. So I think it's interesting in that way. I actually like that part. I didn't think it was a taking of science and sort of a obliteration of it. I thought it was a part, like a mechanical way in which he drew you in and allowed you to see how horrifying it would be to have this experience. And you never really know what was so horrifying. I mean, he does describe, but he doesn't describe nearly enough. He describes the scary mountains more than he describes the actual things that they saw. But you just have this, whoa, I can only imagine what it must have been like to be there. And you kind of can place yourself in that person, in Dyer's shoes a little bit more, especially when he's talking about the running away scene. And you feel a little bit of that adrenaline, and you feel like, I don't know what he was, but I know that feeling of just, not knowing what's out there and just running from it, just being that scared. I think it called on that really well.
I want to ask a question, and excuse my stupidity, but what did Danforth see?
We don't know.
No, I mean, what do you think he saw? Does anybody have any theories about what? I mean, he drove him insane.
Right, just a reflection of the land beyond, of the mountain, the super mountains, and whatever they are concealing, and that domain itself. It's not an entity. It's like the unnameable thing. It's like the energy for it's to me. It felt like he saw, or maybe not even saw is a good word. Like he experienced. Like he touched the face of this sort of other realm of stuff that we can't understand as humans.
And it shook him so intensely that he went insane.
Yeah.
Actually, can I just bring one little passage to your attention? It's on 84 and 85, and page 84 and 85 in my edition. It's in chapter 8, and he's describing the art on the walls of this these underground chambers, and he says, for there was a somber and recurrent type of scene in which the old ones were shown in the act of recoiling affrightedly from some object never allowed to appear in the design, found in the great river and indicated as having been washed down through waving, fine-draped cycad forests from those horrible westward mountains. It's some sort of reference to whatever the hell is in the mountains, but it's vague, and I don't know. Does this say anything? I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm sorry there, Jennifer. I muted you because there was some feedback on your line, and now it's not easy to unmute you. So I'm sorry if you've got a great. There we go. Okay.
Sorry.
Anyway, yeah.
I mean, I can read the quote from the last page, which is Danforth is this final horror. It was After that, Danforth has ever hinted that all that Danforth has ever hinted is that the final horror was a mirage. It was not, he declares, anything connected with the cubes and caves of echoing, vaporous, wormily honeycomb mountains of madness which we crossed with a single fantastic demonic glimpse among the churning zenith clouds, what lay back of those other violet westward mountains which the old ones had shunned and feared. It is very probable that the thing was a sheer delusion, born of the previous stresses we had passed through, and of the actual, though unrecognized mirage of the dead Trans-Montaigne city experienced near Lake's Camp the day before. But it was so real to Danforth that he suffered from it still. He has on rare occasions whispered disjointed and irresponsible things about the Black Pit, the Carven Rim, the Proto-Shoggoths, the windowless solids with 5 dimensions, the nameless cylinders, the Elder Pharaohs, Yog-Sothoth, the primal white jelly, the color out of space, the wings, the eyes in darkness, the moon ladder, the original, the eternal, the undying, and other bizarre conceptions. But when he's fully himself, he repudiates all this and attributes it to his curious and macabre reading of earlier years, the Necronomicon in particular.
Maybe that's what they make the Shoggoths out of. I mean, isn't there a proto-Shoggoth thing in that passage?
Yeah, I don't know what that. I mean, but that is an interesting way of trying to hook the Shoggoth, the thing that they're actually scared of, with this ultimate horror, as opposed to the Shoggoth is like an out of control Saint Bernard, you know, that they engineered past its utility.
It's like it's almost like a dread of life itself or something. This ultimate kind of proto-life thing that they're making all these shapes out of. I don't know, or something like that.
Yeah, it does seem strange. Like these creatures came from space. They've been on other worlds. They are so wise, but yet there's this area that they try to build on, and all the cities decay that they try to build on, and eventually, after they've been here a while, these giant mountains come up and dwarf everything that they've done, and they just shun them after that, and they become humbled by. And maybe this kind of goes with the degradation in, you know, the evolutionary degradation that they are undergoing, you know, physically, culturally, etc. That they talk about that they've lost control themselves. I guess as a final thing that, you know, I was saying that these were put forth maybe as a superior thing to human beings, these zucchini people, saying that not only are we, you know, should we be humbled by the potential presence of something that is much more impressive than we are, but that the fate, I don't think, you know, just the coincidental fate, but the inevitable fate, even of the great species like this, is decay and losing control of whatever, you know, primal thing that allowed them to create life, allowed them to travel from the stars. You know, that there's something that even the great, the much greater than us, will inevitably fall. That's part of the bleak picture here that we're getting.
The big one.
That's interesting.
It's a good point.
Well, can we move into maybe final thoughts, and we'll get to last lines after that, and then maybe some recommendations from anybody who's got them.
Well, I will say that I did enjoy this book. I was not super offended by the flowery language. I do have a background in science, so a lot of the words just sort of like
made sense.
Used to that after a while. All this sort of jargon talk. I don't know anything about horror, so I just really don't have any kind of barometer to, you know, I don't know anything else to measure this against. But I felt like he did a really great job at, you know, dread and all of those kinds of things. I just thought that at times I got a little bored. I was just like, you know, it wasn't a fun and easy read at times. And it wasn't like a devouring kind of book. But I think for me, I don't know. I guess it's interesting because I always wonder how, you know, what is the real thing that we're supposed to take away from this book? But I really felt like it was an existential crisis kind of book. Like, this is just one of those things where, you know, what we don't know or what we think we know is not so solid. And this is just a concrete formation of that theory. And I was interested to read some more of his short stories. I found a couple actually that I actually owned, and I didn't even realize I owned, in a collection of short stories. So yeah, those are my opinions about the book.
I think what I took most out of this is probably maybe keying into a Danforth's experience that what the fear that they confronted, because he keeps talking about, and maybe that I'll just mention my favorite line, which it's in many ways it's hard to find a favorite line in the story, but the line I cued into one was imagination could conceive almost anything in connection with this place. And he said that kind of thing a lot. And I think that it comes out in the Danforth experience, because if you think about it, why did he have that character have that experience? And I think that that was him saying, that was Lovecraft saying that the horror was, again, an objective, uncontrollable, unimaginable, unspeakable horror that he could barely describe. And I really, that I took as such a wonder, the brilliant part of the book that I like, or the brilliant effect of the book that I really liked from this. To me, that's a horror that is beyond my control as a reader. And because it's beyond my control, it's that much more horrifying, and in a good way. So.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to say. I feel like I've put it all out there. I mean,
Yeah, you did.
There's some really enjoyable
Put it
parts.
out there, Nathan.
Yeah. So anyone else have something they'd like to throw in?
Not me.
Dan?
No. I mean, my take on the book is just that it's really good on its own terms, and
You enjoyed it?
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I actually really liked the style because it was so bonkers. So I thought it was, but I'm not sure I'm going to be reading more of him, just because it's like, I still wonder, like, unless you feel like an obsession, a sort of need to kind of go through these experiences, like there's some sort of weird fascination, like, I'm not sure what you're quite getting out of it, right? Like, I'm not sure how. So in any event, that was my one reservation, but I think on its own terms, it's great.
Cool.
All right. Well, we go to last lines. I'm at a disadvantage. I did the audiobook on this one, so I don't have text in front of me. But there was a phrase that I liked the first time I heard it, which was aeon long death. I just thought that was a really nice way of putting the void of the space.
I can give the quote from chapter 11 where he humanizes the aliens. I'm glad Daniel came up with that formulation.
I mean, like, yeah, where's the zucchini aliens?
the elder ones. Let's call them that.
I saw a picture of them on the internet. Someone drew, like, based on the description of the book, drew a picture of them, and they look like zucchini.
They look like
so
zucchini?
That's where,
oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's where you got it.
Big barrels. They should be fatter than that. Anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of great art. I might try and put an email thread together for some of I did some Google searches, and I guess you could all, do your own things, but I'd be interested to see this Alan Moore book because I like a lot of things that he's done. So his adaptation would be interesting.
Anyway, what was your quote there, Mark?
Yeah, it's from chapter 11. He's discovered the ones with their heads cut off. The Shoggoth is killed before he's seen the Shoggoth. He says, "Poor devils, after all, they were not evil things of their kind. They were the men of another age and another order of being. Nature had played a hellish jest on them, as it will on any others that human madness, callousness, or cruelty may hereafter drag up in that hideously dead or sleeping polar waste. And this was their tragic homecoming. They had not even been savages, for what indeed had they done? That awful awakening in the cold of an unknown epoch? Perhaps an attack by the furry, frantically barking quadrupeds, and a day's defense against them, and the equally frantic white simians with the queer wrappings and paraphernalia. Poor Lake, poor Gedney, poor old ones. Scientists to the last. What had they done that we would not have done in their place? God, what intelligence and persistence! What a facing of the incredible, just as those carven kinsmen and forebears had faced things only a little less incredible. Radiates, vegetables, monstrosities, star spawn, whatever they had been, they were men." There you go.
Wow.
Can I give my closing quote, which is right before that?
Sure.
Sure.
All right, now he's describing the Shagas. It's literally right before, and I think this is a great sentence. Formless protoplasm able to mock and reflect all forms and organs and processes. Vicious agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids, infinitely plastic and ductile, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great God, what madness made even those blasphemous old ones willing to use and to carve such things?
Yeah, that's language. That's another positivity. He does use language well. In isolation, you can find really good passages.
What about Jennifer? Hello?
Yeah, my favorite one was in the same chapter. Half paralyzed with terror though we were, there was nevertheless fanned within us a blazing flame of awe and curiosity which triumphed in the end.
Right. I remember that line. That goes to the question of why didn't they just turn around and leave?
And just the general, moving forward of all of humankind, our drive
to keep
the
going.
fear of the unknown comes out of our curiosity, right? Because at the end, no matter how curious we are, I think we all have that realization that no matter how much we question, no matter how much we try to figure out, there's some level to which we understand we're like we can't know the end of it all. We can't know the absolute everything.
You never know what's around that corner.
But we keep asking, and we just have that drive within us.
It just occurred to me there's a detail of the plot that I think I left out that is kind of important for the passage that I just read. Why he thinks they're scientists is because in the cave or so before he finds the dead zucchini men, he finds the missing guy and the Gendry and the missing dog that have been taken as scientific samples. They've been carefully wrapped up. So they were
just like Lake had done with one of the corpses of the zucchini monsters that he found.
Yep.
Wild.
Yeah.
Just wild.
Well, I wonder. We're going long, and it's been great. But I wonder if everybody has maybe a recommendation of something. You can, if it's something similar or anything else that you're reading and just like it can be out of left field or what have you. But yeah, does anybody have any?
People should go watch The Thing. That's the until they actually make a movement of this book. John Carpenter's The Thing.
Oh yeah.
It takes the best part and it leaves it unknown. That's the great part about it. You don't know where it came from or anything, and it's just a force that is destructive and terrifying.
Speaking of horror, I happened to watch, and you brought it up earlier. I think it was you, Nathan, right? The movie Aliens.
Oh yeah.
I watched it for like the 30th time last night. I don't know why, and I never understood why it didn't win Best Picture. When you look at it, because when you've seen it 30 times like I have, you can see what who's the director again?
That was James Cameron who took it over after Ridley
James
Scott.
Cameron did Aliens 2. It was
that's what I thought. So there's Alien and Aliens. Aliens is the second one. I thought that's what you were talking about. I think James Cameron did.
Aliens.
You're talking about Alien. Okay.
Yeah, the first one. I can't believe it. He's such a famous director. I can't believe I can't remember his name.
Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott, right? Ridley Scott. And when you've seen it 30 times, you can see what an incredible job he did. I mean, you can see how it works out, and you become aware of the whole the product. Anyway, my point is that I kept thinking, why did this not win Best Picture? And I realized it's because it was science fiction, horror, right? Those kind of movies I don't think win Best Picture, right?
Yeah, it's not serious or something.
Yeah, they just don't. I don't know why. Anyway.
All right. Any others out there? I mean, The Thing. I had that. That would be a good film to piggyback on this.
I don't have anything.
Oh, all right. yeah, everybody. Then I wouldn't. So the thing is already taken. I don't really have anything to offer for a book or anything like that. Maybe everybody should listen to the daily, the podcast. I don't know. Well,
I mean, I'm going through a major Virginia Woolf stage, so I've committed to read everything she's ever written. So I recommend that. I mean, I recently finished Night and Day by Virginia Woolf, which is one of her earliest novels and has a lot of problems, but it's amazing.
oh, I want to jump in here. Just piggybacking on horror and language. I think that if you want to hear, so read the Legion of Horribles passage from Blood Meridian, and
Oh yeah,
that is real terrifying and beautiful language. It's got and it's only got one period for 3 pages. It's just a great section that you can read on its own and get a taste for this language.
Mm.
Actually, I do have one horror recommendation. Okay, it's the Pardoner's Tale from Chaucer's from Canterbury Tales, and you read the prologue and the story itself. The story is the basis for the Treasure of Sierra Madre. It's the same basic plot, and it's probably the best horror story I've ever read. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, interesting.
I didn't bring up Virginia Woolf because of horror stories. I just brought her up because that's what I was reading.
Sure.
All right. Well, we'll email regarding the next read, right, everybody?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. All right.
Sounds good.
All right,
Thanks
well,
for
thanks,
humoring
guys.
me and doing this
That's
topic.
great. All right. Well,
Thanks.
take care.
Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah. Well, be in touch. Email.
Yeah, great talking with all of you. I really enjoyed
Take
it.
care. All right.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks.
Great
Bye.
talk.
How about?
Bye.